This computer. Okay, got it. Now we're recording. All right. So last week, did you finish and get through everything you wanted to for last week? Anybody have any questions left over from last week's discussion on medieval Judaism? No? Okay. So can somebody tell me just a minute, just in a minute wrap up of where you kind of left off with medieval Judaism last week? Anybody?
Oh, I can. Oh, oops. I was trying to find the mute button. I'm sorry. Okay, my bad. Did I lose myself? Okay, there we go. Okay. We started talking about the pogroms and Kabbalah, and I think I told everybody too about the Talmud being like the internet compared to my ADHD brain before and after medicine, but when it was like more organized. About where we were at.
Great. Okay. Great. So this week we're moving on to the next period within Judaism, and we're going to be talking about the modern period, which extends from the time of kind of where you left off of the time of the Haskalah up through Zionism, the Holocaust, which we'll be talking about next week. What was going on in the world kind of during this period of time, during the Haskalah? What was happening in Europe? Basically, let's talk a little bit about what was happening in Europe during that time and what brought about, like what marked the modern Judaism period, but what was happening in the world around kind of around the Jewish world, not in the Jewish world, but what was happening in the world at the time of the Haskalah. What was the Haskalah, and how did that impact? How did Enlightenment in general impact Judaism? But first, let's talk a little bit about what was Enlightenment. What was the age of Enlightenment? What was the basic idea of the Enlightenment?
I found this on the web.
Whoops. Anybody? What marked the... Oh, go ahead.
I go. Sorry, I wouldn't raise my hand, but I got a background. The Enlightenment was when basically science, arts, that all explode. I mean, like went big and like went popular, and at the end of the so-called Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm. Good. Very good. Yeah. So basically, the Age of Enlightenment, exactly as you're saying, was also called the Age of Reason. It was an intellectual, a philosophical movement throughout Europe, especially in Western Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, where that really had ideas that focused on reason. Oh, is somebody talking? On reason, bringing about liberty for people, the idea of the separation of religion and state came around, lots of new principles and ideas, really bringing new ideas, as you said, to art, to culture, to literature, people talking about their ideas in academies and coffee houses, and the idea of individual liberties was founded, religious tolerance. There was more of an opposition to the church, the dogmas of the church, to a monarchy, and the concepts were much more of an emphasis on scientific, on science, and on sort of growth, enlightenment, the individual, all of those types of things. And as that started to come around, what did people have to say, and as there was certainly as with the separation or the beginnings of the idea of the separations of religion and state, because previously every country was ruled essentially by its own government that was more or less what we would look at today as being a religious government. You also saw the idea of separation of powers, the US Constitution, and then the biggest, one of the biggest sort of game changers, so to speak, for Judaism was in France, the idea of the emancipation, and the idea in France of sort of that separation between religion and state, and also that the idea that whereas before Jews had been looked at as a problem everywhere during that time, during the medieval period, there was this idea that came about first in France that perhaps, and I'll put it pretty much the way the French sort of the French Enlightenment put it, or the French people put it, which was that with respect to religion, that perhaps we understand that the Jews have been, I mean, again, sort of in these words, I'm putting my own little spin on it. This is not what they said exactly, although not so far off, is that we know that Jews are dirty, rotten people. And we know that we've had a lot of problems with Jews, and Jews are not very enlightened. But actually, the problem is that if we just emancipated Jews and didn't keep them separate from everybody else and let them have rights, then the Jews wouldn't be so dirty and rotten, and they might actually become more like us. Does that sound familiar in anything anybody's read? Yes, Krissa.
I guess maybe we're going to touch on this later, but can you speak on like the Reformation? Because I mean, that was in the early 1500s, and I know Martin Luther did not like the Jews, and that, I mean, we're talking about France, and Martin Luther is not in France, but is this related? How does the Reformation and the split between the rise of Protestantism, and then is that, because I know that after most Protestants probably felt pretty negatively towards Jews based on Martin Luther's comments.
Yeah, I mean, Martin Luther did not like Jews at all. But I think what the Reformation brought about was an idea of maybe questioning somewhat the predominant order of religion as it was in being in life, and it sort of opened up the idea of change within the Christian church, which also brought about the idea of kind of that maybe Jews also, it kind of brought I mean, but I mean, let's, the Reformation for the Jews had a lot of humiliation, suffering, and then also the Catholic counter to the Reformation was that the reformers were responsible for its Judaizing tendencies. So that was something that, it was definitely not open. The Reformation wasn't open to Jews, but it also, some of the anti-Jewish claims of the church, it allowed for some questioning to begin to happen, even though it probably, I mean, I think it's questionable as to whether or not it was good or bad for the Jews. I don't know if that's what you're asking.
Well, I was just thinking, because you were talking about in France, they're saying that maybe we should grant some rights and freedoms to the Jews, but then in Italy and Germany, it seems like it's the opposite around this time. So I just thought that was interesting. And I I may be confusing this with something else, but I'm pretty sure that I thought in Italy they had the Jews wear a star, and I thought that's what Hitler got his idea
Yeah,
from.
yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
and it took a lot longer, by the way. I mean, I think that's an important thing that you're bringing up. It took a lot longer. France was the first country to grant citizen. Remember, Jews didn't have citizenship anywhere. And during the entire well, really, Jews didn't have citizenship anywhere, period. Not that there was, you know, what did citizenship mean is a whole different question because every country is different. But the Reformation didn't really help Jews per se. There was a lot of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic parts to the Reformation. But I think the Reformation brought about the idea of the questioning of the church as it has always been. I think that's kind of what I was trying to say. But you're right. I mean, it took a lot longer. You know, if you look at, and I don't know that I know the dates offhand, I could probably look it up and see, but if you look at the dates of when Jews got citizenship in each of the different countries in Europe, it varies greatly from country to country. It was just that the French were the first to explore that question.
A totally different question if we're,
What?
can I ask a different question? Or if we're,
Sure.
If we're done, no, that's okay. So last time we were talking, as it happens, can you guys hear me?
It's hard to hear you. There's an echo.
Okay. Yeah, there's an echo here. Let me see if I can, but maybe I'll put the question in the. Anyone else wants to go first?
What?
She's putting the question in the chat.
Oh, got it. Okay. Did anybody else have other questions while she's writing in her question? Do you have your hand up, Jackie?
I'm sorry, I'm not using on my iPhone for this. Weren't the Kishinev pogroms the same time around that happening in Moldova, where Moldova was, because it happened in 1901 or 1905 or something?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. I don't know. I know that in 1791, the National Assembly of France granted Jews citizenship. They were the first. They were really the first in terms of emancipating Jews. It was only much later in Greece. It was 1830. In Great Britain, it was 1858. In Italy, it was 1870. In Germany, it was 1871, and in Norway, 1891. So Jews are getting citizenship much later than we might even realize in many, many countries. So, you know, and some were as late, and I'm trying to remember, there were who I visited somewhere where Jews hadn't gotten citizenship. I can't think where it was in Europe until like 1960 or something like that. I can't remember where it was though. But anyways, just to go back for a minute, the emancipation of Jews in France took place when there was the big it was definitely linked to the French Revolution, and they use the Declaration of Rights of, I think it was, let's see, I'm gonna look it up. It's 1789, where people should have the idea of openness, and a person shouldn't be kind of seen as inferior because of their opinions, including their religious opinions. And eventually, there were national laws that were put into place, along with discussions of full equality for Jews. And like I said, it was finally granted in September of 1791. But it really wasn't a very pretty process. So, sorry. When their National Assembly essentially debated for like 2 years or so, that where they debated things like Jews should be denied as a nation, but granted as individual citizenship. Every Jew must become a citizen individually, and otherwise they're going to be expelled. It's unacceptable for Jews to be a nation within a nation, so they have to kind of become French, as they would have said at the time, Frenchmen first, and that has to be primary. And the only reason that they hadn't done that sooner was because it was the way that they were treated. And if we treated them like everybody else, then they would be just like everybody else. And so it really wasn't like wasn't like done in a way that I would say like, oh, this is great because we love Jews. It was done much more of, well, we know that the Jews are not that great and we don't really like them that much, but maybe if we gave them citizenship, they would start acting more like us and behave better, was essentially the way that citizenship was granted. And then Sharon, your question, I'm not sure. I think it may have been, I'm not sure to your question either, Jackie. Sharon, you're asking, how much would you say Jewish scholarship followed the trajectory of Dark Ages to Enlightenment we learn about for Western culture generally? I wonder, because last class we talked about Maimonides combining reconciling Jewish scholarship with science of the day. Yep. Which already had, absolutely. Yes, I would say very much so that Judaism was influenced by what was happening with Enlightenment in the world, and the movement within Judaism of sort of the Jewish Enlightenment was called Haskalah, and the Haskalah comes from the Hebrew word for enlightenment, basically, and it was a movement in Europe that lasted from somewhere for close to 100 years, starting in the late 1700s to the late 1800s. And it was inspired definitely by the European Enlightenment, but had its own sort of Jewish nature to it. And it comes from the Hebrew word sechel, which means reason or wisdom or intellect. And it was very much, it encouraged Jews to study secular subjects, and to learn both European and Hebrew languages, to start getting into other fields like arts, sciences, agriculture, those kinds of things. And many of the followers of the Haskalah wanted to assimilate into European society, both in dress, language, the way that they acted, that type of thing. And eventually the Haskalah influenced the creation of both the Reform movement and the Zionist movement, which we'll talk more about next week. But that was definitely deeply influenced by what was happening in the world around us, and by the Enlightenment period. And Jews who had never kind of been out of the ghettos began to be emancipated slowly from the ghettos, and began to interact in societies where they lived. And and it began in probably Germany. It began, like I said, it began in Europe and then spread. One of the big changes is that those Maskilim, as it was called, those who practiced, or those who were bringing about the Haskalah, wanted to remove the Talmud as being central in Jewish education. They wanted to look at secular knowledge, like I said, modern languages, and train Jewish children in like common sense and tolerance and reasonableness. And they also were looking at ideas around them from all different places. And they were also being influenced by the countries in Europe where they lived, who were also encouraging them to have more normal schools for their children. And some began to attend general secular studies schools and universities. And let's see what else. The first Haskalah school was in Berlin in 1778. Let's see, let me look at my other notes. Those are some of the big, I think those are some of the major. It also, one of the big things is it marked the end of the use of Yiddish and the revival of Hebrew. And as I said before already, a lot of the European languages people began to learn and study as well. I think, does that answer kind of what you were asking, Sharon? Yeah, good. And great question. Why did people want Jews to assimilate? Let me throw that out to everybody. Why did the world want Jews to assimilate? What did the world at that point in time think of Jews? Anybody? Jackie.
They still thought they were all the cunning, thought they were like basically sketchy people still. So with the Enlightenment, they're like, hey, if you become more like us, you won't be as sketchy.
Pretty much. Jews were still seen as exactly as and also Jews, as I'm sure you talked about last week, Jews living in ghettos. Did you talk about that last week? With the first ghetto being in Italy, and Jews, Jews which came from the Italian word for glass factory, because that's where the ghettos were first first put in Italy, and then spread throughout Europe, where Jews were living in separate parts of the cities, wherever they, whichever city they happened to be, city or country they happened to be in. Jews were relegated to living in their own areas with their own sort of rule and that type of thing. And so, and definitely segregated from the societies around them. You saw them all over. And with citizenship in some places, the ghettos began to break down, and Jews were allowed to live where they wanted somewhat, and that type of thing. Any questions on that? We saw a huge rise in anti-Semitism after emancipation. After the Jews were let out of the ghettos, there was a huge rise in anti-Semitism after emancipation. Any thoughts on that? Anybody? Yes, Carissa.
I just find that interesting because the government granted them these freedom and rights, and now the people are against it. But the people probably are very worried that these rumors that they're hearing about the Jewish people are actually going to be true, which then in turn forces the Jews to want to assimilate more and remove themselves more from Judaism. And so maybe this is the time where Judaism is more seen as a religion rather than a nation, a people, a community, because as they're entering into the normal Western European society, the Jews are hiding their identity more, speaking less Hebrew, and they're just going to services on the weekends, just like the Christians are. So it becomes seen more like a religion. I believe I read in one of the books that this is the time when they changed the word synagogue to temple to make it less Jewish, less different seeming. And then this led the rabbis to do their own kind of counter reformation of sorts to build up Reform Judaism and then conservative Judaism as well. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, absolutely.
But I think there's a difference between what's happening in Western Europe and then Eastern Europe. I believe Eastern Europe is far behind Western Europe. They're not assimilating to the culture as much. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and it's also different in Sephardic countries as well, very different outside of Europe. No, that's exactly right, Carissa. And, as there was all of this economic change in general, which is important to mention that in society in general, in European society, there was a lot of economic change, and Jews did, as you said, started to work among non-Jews. But then they faced this new anti-Semitism, because before it was like the Jews were over kind of living by themselves in their own areas of town or their own ghettos or wherever they were living, didn't have citizenship and were governing themselves. And for them, Judaism, exactly what you said, was much more of a culture, a community. It was sort of an all-encompassing piece of your life. You didn't really have a choice but to be a part of it because you weren't accepted outside of it. And now with emancipation, Jews were working among non-Jews, and all of a sudden they were like part of the secular and the social and the economic community, and Judaism became much more of a religion, exactly, as opposed to being a whole people and a nation. And Jews finally could own land, could be part of the civil service. They could serve in some countries in the armed forces. And there were non-Jews who didn't want Jews taking their jobs, because before, Jews couldn't work among non-Jews in many countries. And so then all of a sudden, before, Jews could be in finance, banking, trade, medicine, law, journalism, all the different types of professions. And previously, that wasn't always the case, although Jews were always allowed, for a long time, were allowed to be money lenders, which brought about a lot of hatred toward Jews. And then also you saw education, people getting secular educations, and Jews as well. Yeah, so that kind of, I think that's exactly what you were saying. And as that started to happen, we saw anti-Semitism being different, but certainly you saw a lot of the classic anti-Semitic stereotypes and myths of Jews being cheap, and Jews being smelly, and Jews being not being loyal, that you couldn't trust Jews, and Jews were rich, and Jews were moneylenders, and Jews. So a lot of those classic stereotypes that you see, like some of the most famous, one of the most famous ones would have been Shylock from Shakespeare, that had been brought from earlier times. And you saw a lot of those things reemerging and hearing of those things. And that you couldn't, you couldn't trust Jews. So that's a great question. The blood libels actually were preceded the Enlightenment. The myth of the blood libels actually came about much earlier, really. Those were from the Middle Ages, and it was the false allegations that Jews would kill Christian children and use their blood for ritual, like for rituals, particularly related to Passover was a big one, which was a complete lie that had actually been brought about by the church. And that was something, and that Jews were poisoning the wells was another big one, but those were from the medieval period where those originated, not during the modern period. Those were much older than the modern period, so to speak. Other questions, thoughts, things that you want to make sure that we bring up? And maybe oh yes, Jackie.
I have a question. What about the pogroms? Were they prominent during that time? Because I read about those.
Those were
happening.
also from
Pogroms
the
were-
more from the medieval period. There were some in the modern period as well. It was basically, it referred, they were medieval as well as modern, but the pogroms refer to the violent attacks against Jews in it's a Russian word. Mostly it was taking place in Russia, but also in and that was 1800s. So I guess during the modern time, that I guess wouldn't be medieval, but definitely they were extensive anti-Jewish riots that went across the Russian Empire. And then you saw them continuing into Germany and Eastern Europe in the Holocaust under a new name. And yeah. What did you do? No, the blood libel I said came from the medieval period. That preceded. Oh yeah, that was your question from before, not from now. Sorry. I wouldn't be surprised if there were blood libels in Moldova. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I'm sure there probably were. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts about this period, questions about this period that you would have? Again, I think the biggest question of this period for the Jewish community and the Jewish world was how, and this I think you talked about a little bit, Carissa, which is how do we be Jewish and live in the modern world? I mean, that was really the pervasive question during this time period. is how to do that, how to not face anti-Semitism. I think that's really, yeah. And I think that got answered in a variety of different ways. Which ranged from Jews trying to distance themselves from their Judaism, it becoming more of what we see it as a religion today versus a culture and a community, as well as the different movements of Judaism beginning to emerge. It's when we began to see the Reform movement emerging as a way to answer that question of how can we be Jewish and good French people or English people or Germans or whatever. And it was as a way to see Judaism. How do we live in the modern world as Jews? How do we get rid of those customs that make us different? And how can we be part of the world and part of the community? And then you saw that ranging from the rise of the Reform movement and then kind of neo-Orthodoxy, which was that response of saying, well, we can be true to our Judaism and keep the traditions and the customs that we've always kept, and hold true to halakha or Jewish law while still being good citizens of the country that we're living in. And the Reform and the conservative movement. Yes, Carissa.
I was wondering if you could touch more on the Judaism during this time period in Eastern Europe, especially with like the Hasidic masters and that, and the growth of Hasidicism in general and mysticism. I find that really fascinating. So
Yeah, so it's interesting, the rise of Hasidism, I think, is one of the most interesting questions of the period, because the Hasidic movement, originally, it first arose in as an Orthodox movement that was sort of reviving more of a way of like drawing on Jewish mystical tradition and wanting to have a more direct experience with God and having more like bringing the ritual and the prayer closer to the people. And they would often have like a charismatic leader who would be leading them. And it was definitely much more of a way to be closer to Judaism, to celebrate Judaism more. The Baal Shem Tov is probably the most famous leader who traveled widely and developed a very strong following. And rather than really focusing on Jewish law, he would urge people to develop his followers to develop more of a personal relationship with God, and referred a lot to the mystical state of connection with God through spirituality, through prayer, through dance, through music, through that type of thing. And certainly wasn't a way to, it was meant for the masses. It was a way to bring mysticism to the masses. And it was also, as I said, it was less based on study, and more of like folksy and wanted to be much more like where the people were. Ironically, it's become one, kind of the extreme of orthodoxy, as opposed to what it began with in its roots, and very focused on law and following ritual and law. So that's a great question. Did that answer kind of what you were asking? Great. Other questions? Good. I think that's anything else you want to make sure I touch on? All right. And I think we will end for today. All right. Thank you. Oh, Sharon.
No.
Bye. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night. Bye.